Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in our webinar on federalism in India. You would have sort of seen that the title of this webinar is as part of the series that we at Viri Center for Legal Policy are doing, which is titled Conscience Keepers, the Judiciary as the Constitutional Guardian. And we're covering about 4 different themes as part of this series. We'll have one a week or so for the next 4 weeks. And the first topic that we decided to speak on and decided to invite speakers on is on federalism in India. And you would have seen the title, which is Federalism in India, is it cooperative, competitive, or adversarial? And that is something that we hope to discuss in the course of the next 45 minutes to 1 hour or so. And that is something that we have 2 very eminent speakers to talk to us about it. What we will be doing today is to look at this particular issue of federalism in India, give a little bit of context in the past, and primarily focus on what are the challenges that federalism in India, especially center-state relations in India, are facing. We want to take not just the constitutional perspective as to what does the constitution provide for, what the courts have said, but also the political perspective and also the academic perspective. And to that end, we have with us as I mentioned, 2 very eminent speakers. I will introduce them very briefly. We have Dr. M. Govind Rao, who has been a member of the Finance Commission. He was a member of the 14th Finance Commission and also director of NIPFP. He has been a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India with the rank of Minister of State. And he has been director of the Institute of Social and Economic Change as well in Bangalore, and somebody who has numerous publications to his record and has written some excellent books on public finance and federalism. Welcome to this webinar, Dr. Govind Rao.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you with us. We also have with us Dr. P. Tyagarajan. He is currently an MLA from Madurai West, if I got that correct. And he is somebody who was elected an MLA in 2016 and serves on the Public Accounts Committee in the Tamil Nadu State Legislative Assembly. He's also someone who has had deep experience in in working with global multinationals and has worked in a lot of different countries in this capacity. He brings with him a rich experience of having worked on matters related to federalism and worked on matters concerning center-state relations. And he is somebody who writes about and talks about, he's also spokesperson for the DMK party on largely issues of economic issues and so on. And which is why we thought it would be great to have him on board with the webinar. Welcome, Dr. Tyagarajan. It was very nice of you to agree to be on our webinar. So
thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So let me begin very briefly by setting the context for what we're going to be talking about today. Most of us, we have an idea that India is some sort of a federalism. But let us understand first and foremost that a federal country is not just a country where there is a center and there are states. The Constitution empowers the states on par with the center with some lawmaking powers, executive powers, definitely not judicial powers, but in this context, independent of the center. It's not the center giving the state certain power, the Constitution vesting certain powers both in the center and the state. That's what distinguishes a federalism from a purely unitary country. Now, what sort of federalism is it? Very initially, those of us who are constitutional lawyers used to make the argument that India was a quasi-federal polity. It's not really that federal, because those of us who would have followed politics would know that state governments could be dismissed by the center. The center could override and make legislation on topics. In certain instances, could make legislation and override state powers and certain legislation in certain areas. And there are a lot of ways in which the center can sort of supersede the state in many ways. But I would make the argument that this approach has changed quite dramatically. Part of that change is political. You've had the rise of regional political parties. We have seen coalition governments successfully complete terms in the central government. We have seen, of course, coalition governments complete terms with the state government. We have seen regional parties or regionalist parties be part of governments at the center and put forth their demand and also assert their state's interests at a national level. And we have also seen a change in how the judiciary has understood federalism in India. And I want to set the context in 2 very important cases. And those they don't have immediate bearing, they will have some, they will make a lot of sense when our panelists sort of speak about these issues. You will see why it is the space exists and what is the future forward. One big area that has changed over the years is on the question of precedence rule. I mentioned that the center has the power to impose precedence rule based on a governor's report. In fact, all the way up to 1993, court said, it's purely a political function. We're not going to interfere. But in 94, in SR Bommai versus Union of India, the Supreme Court made a dramatic U-turn. Supreme Court said, no, we're going to look into it. We're going to see if the governor's report is based on objective information. We're going to see if the governor acted in the course of his or her duties in properly deciding who's in a majority and thereby directing and thereby, sending a report that there is no majority and no government is possible. And what we have seen since is that courts have been willing to stand up for states when governor's rules have been imposed. Two recent cases, one in Arunachal Pradesh, one in Uttarakhand, where the Supreme Court actually set aside the imposition of governor's rule. And in a few other cases, before it could even come to that, the court ensured that there was a floor test. Like the governor couldn't just impose whoever the ruling party at the center wanted, but said have a floor test. We have seen this in Maharashtra, we have seen this in Karnataka, and in a few other states, which happened recently. So we've seen that the judiciary has taken up a more, I wouldn't say pro-state, but a less pro-center approach to federalism when it comes to that approach. The second aspect that I sort of want to mention is something that it's actually even more dramatic than this, but unfortunately has not been discussed about. But in 2016, the Supreme, in 16-17, the Supreme Court overturned a 50-year-old precedent. In Jindal Stainless versus State of Haryana, Supreme Court overturned two important judgments in the 1960s, which was Athiya Tea Company and Rajasthan Motor Works, which had said that when it comes to the imposition of entry tax, the states need to take the center's permission, rather the president's permission. The Supreme Court said in Jindal Stainless that the states don't need to. And if you read that judgment, you will realize the distance that has been traveled in how the court has perceived the power of states to levy taxes and raise revenues and carry out their functions. There is a very different idea of what federalism is. And there are multiple opinions. It was a majority of 6-3. There are majority and there are minority opinions in this judgment. But even the three judges in the minority in this particular case acknowledge how important federalism is, but differ on its scope. If you actually were to compare it, you will find that the three judges in Jindal Stainless were actually more pro-state than even the majority pro-state judges in the minority pro-state judges in the older cases. So in 50 years, there has been a sea change in the thinking of the judiciary on how federalism should work. Is it good? What's the good about it? And so on. Which brings us to the current context. It brings us to the current moment. In the last 1 year, we have seen multiple issues of center-state friction, I'd like to call it. I'll not put any particular value judgment as to who is the right or the wrong, and I'll allow our panelists to go in depth into it. We have seen a lot of center-state on 4 or 5 issues. And this 4 or 5 issues is what I want to focus our discussion on. Two of these are fiscal issues. One is related to the compensation granted in the context of the GST. We have seen that the states are very upset that the center refused to give them compensation money that it had that it said it couldn't afford to pay anymore. That it had promised in a law. The center had promised in the law that states which had signed on to the GST would receive compensation at a certain fixed percentage for the next 5 years. The center said, sorry, that's not happening. The second source of potential friction has been in the context of the 15th Finance Commission. Now, the report has been submitted, and obviously we don't know the contents of the report, but the two main issues which have caused source of concern is on what basis, forget about the percentage, on what basis will money be distributed between the states, and also should the states be asked to pay for defense and internal security by creating a special fund. This is something that was sort of indicated in the terms of reference. Now, the 15th Finance Commission has taken a view, and we don't know what that view is, but we hope today to discuss what are the merits of these sides and which side should eventually prevail in this particular debate. A third big issue has been over NEET, which is the National Entrance Cum Eligibility Test for medical students. We have seen that states such as Tamil Nadu have said that this is something which goes against the interests of the state, and this is something that affects their students. But we sort of want to go into why is it that is a decentralized way of testing a better way, or is it a centralized way of testing which is a better way? And what is the basis for this discomfort with the test? Because as students, and as you know, but somebody who has not written an entrance exam anytime recently, but who speaks to students, students might say a common entrance test is great, but what are the other implications of it? A fourth issue, which has, and still we would say it's an ongoing issue, is related to the three laws which, quote unquote, look to liberalize the farming sector in the country. Agriculture under the constitution is a state subject, which means that the state has exclusive power to make laws. But we've seen that three major legislations have been passed by the center. And we have seen that there have been strong protests against these legislations across the country. State governments have even gone so far as to say that we will not implement these laws. I think Punjab and Rajasthan have passed resolutions or actual legislation to say that that the central legislation will not be implemented in our states. And we find that there is strong pushback by the state saying, you're encroaching onto our territory. So we want to try and understand what is the basis for this particular angst. A final issue is something that has been commented upon, is the the effort to fight COVID itself. Keep in mind, when the WHO declared a breakout of a pandemic, we didn't have any law which clearly told us what we should do, or rather what the government should do to address a pandemic which is raging across the country. What was instead done was the use of powers under the Disaster Management Act to impose a lockdown and impose restrictions on what activities can and cannot be conducted. But over the 8 months that we have had experienced this lockdown, or 7.5 to 8 months, we have seen that the center has changed its approach from a heavily centralized everything to be determined by the center to each state should figure out its own way. Each state should figure out how best to do it. Is it a question of the state center becoming wise to the actual challenges later, or is it that the center found the limits of its capacity? Was it that initially the center should have taken a more decentralized approach because certain states had already taken their measures to fight COVID in their cities, and what should be and how to fight it, and center then imposed the lockdown? And should the center have necessarily imposed a lockdown is a question that people have asked and raised. What did it do to the federal structure of the country when directives were coming out from the Ministry of Home Affairs as to this shop should be open, this shop should not be open? These are some of the issues that we want to discuss today. And I want to start with Dr. Tyagarajan specifically on NEET and also on perhaps the farm bills to help us understand what is the essential basis for the discomfort for this. And I will then move to Professor Govindrao, who can give us a more academic perspective also to talk about the financial aspect of this matter. So, Mr. Tyagarajan.
Great. Thank you very much. I should just make a slight correction on the MLA for Madurai Central Constituency, not West, but it's almost irrelevant. So I'll just make 3 or 4 points. As somebody who has run global businesses for large banks and has operated in many countries, I would first start with saying India is the most centralized, least devolved power large country in the world. If you look at the United States as one extreme and China as the other extreme in terms of capitalism and communism, both those countries delegate a lot of authority and a lot of rulemaking and a lot of governance down to the cities, school boards, police departments. In China, banking licenses are given by state. In the US, the state election process for president is run by the states and answerable in the state courts, not in a federal court. So, we are about the only large country in the world where we have this delusion that a country of 1.38 billion people who are so vastly different, Bihar, where the average age is 19 and the per capita income is 50,000 and the average education is elementary school dropout, should be treated the same way in the same one nation, one X formula as a Tamil Nadu, where the average age is 31 or 32. Average education is high school graduate and per capita income is 2 lakhs plus. So I think it's a delusion, and every day in every way we are finding that this delusion is creating real bad outcomes for us. Now, as far as NEET goes, it is a black and white issue. If you want to run a central institute and you want to fund it, by all means, run whatever test you want. But if we are funding it 100% with our tax money, and as somebody who appeared before the 15th Finance Commission and presented to Mr. N.K. Singh, I want to make the point that already the finance commissions of the last 25 years have been utter failures from a standpoint of federalism. If the idea is that better off, more developed states should contribute to nation building more, and that therefore, like in China, like in Europe, like in America, the gap between the haves and the have-nots should narrow, we have failed miserably. With every decade, the gap has widened and widened and widened. So we used to pay a rupee in taxes from Tamil Nadu, we used to get back 65, 70 paisa. Now we get back 38. We are still substantially better in every measure than a Bihar that gets back 4 rupees and cannot pay its state wages, the state employees' wages, unless it gets a central transfer. So in this kind of trajectory, when we pay for our state education, which is so intricately linked to our public health model, using our legislative assembly, and we have a track record that shows us as the best state in medicine in India. We have 4 doctors per 1,000 people. That's like 6 times better than the Indian average. Why do we believe the government of India has any either status, competence, or authority to tell us how we should run the medical colleges that we fund with our money for our students? It's a fundamental question. Moving on to the farm bills, I think we are now starting to see the breakdown of federalism. You know, as long as we had coalition governments or even the Congress governments, Congress-led coalition governments, who in their own way had this delusion of empire, that they could run everything from Delhi rather than kind of devolve powers, they were still within some limit of constraint. Now we have people whose psychology is that they are going to dictate to the rest of the country how it ought to be done when their own track record is miserable and far below the average for a place like Tamil Nadu. And so we are now seeing states simply refuse to go along. As you point out, many of these subjects are state subjects. I'm a sitting member of the assembly. We have commercial tax laws that we have to amend. If the GST Council approves a new rate or a new methodology, we have to go and pass a bill. At some point, we're going to say it's this far and no further. Why do you keep dictating to us and we have to keep passing the bill? Let's see how the Constitution actually breaks down or not. So I think we're reaching that stage where the states are unwilling to be kind of docile, silent partners where something is thrust upon them. And then we are expected to follow as if there's some all-knowing, all-seeing, benevolent dictator sitting in Delhi who can tell us how we ought to run our lives. I think, you know, we have a unanimous bill in the legislature twice in our Tamil Nadu assembly, twice saying that we don't want to run this test. And the president has refused to sign the bill. So I think we are reaching that point where we should be worried about a serious breakdown, because unlike most other countries, we have a huge discrepancy in India. In China or in Europe or in the US, the states that have the highest populations also have the highest GDPs, highest tax bases, highest contributions to the economy, highest net transfer payments. In India, we have the exact opposite. The states that have the highest per capita GDPs and highest net contributions are the ones that have the smallest population, because we got population under control. That's a kind of virtuous cycle. Because we got population under control, we grew fast. And so you're going to have this battle where kind of government that is elected by largely the kind of lower income, lower education states is trying to impose its will on the higher income, higher education states. And there's a breaking point. It's just not, it's not possible to extend this in one direction continuously. That's my view, at least to start.
Sure. Thank you, sir. And that's a great point that you make. What you just said at the right part. I think a couple of economists have actually written about this phenomenon, and they call it the 3-3-3 problem, where the 3 richest states in India by per capita income, the 3 richest states in India are 3 times richer than the 3 poorest states. So which is probably, I think, Haryana, Punjab, and Gujarat are 3 times richer than Bihar, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh, if I'm not mistaken. Which is sort of is a nice segue to come into what I want Professor Govinda to speak, because I have, and as you correctly pointed out, sir, when we exchanged emails, that the term cooperative, competitive, and maybe even coercive federalism, they have very specific academic connotations. And I didn't have time in my initial parts to go in depth into it. But let me just ask you to sort of clarify for us what these concepts essentially mean, and two, what you make of the issues that you find in the specific context of fund transfers, in the specific context of the GST. What do you think are what do you think about the kinds of arguments that are being made in the context of the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission and this debate about the GST compensation? So,
well, Alok, you have put the entire scheme of things before me, and then that would take quite a considerable amount of time. And obviously, I will have to be brief.
Yes.
No, somehow or other in this country, sort of everything is common sense. When you say cooperative federalism, you think that it is simple cooperation. When you say competitive federalism, it's a simple competition. The point is, these have very specific connotations. Political scientists, for the most part, basically believed that the government is a benevolent entity, and therefore cooperation is a given thing, and there should be cooperation. You see, that's a normative thing. There should be cooperation between the union and the states, and therefore the cooperative federalism is. And then it was taken to be completely different from competitive federalism, because either you have competitive federalism or cooperative federalism, which is not the case. By very nature, the interesting part was this happened in Canada. There was a commission on federal provincial relations, and Albert Breton was one of the members. And Albert Breton, right from the day one, started thinking that there is basic relationship between the union, between the federal and provinces, as well as between one province and another, is a competitive relationship. Basic relationship between one economist and another is competitive because everybody is competing for the same journal space. Let us understand that. So there is basic relationship is competitive. I went on to write a note of dissent, which is called the Minority Report to the McDonald Commission, which he published in Journal of Political Economy, where he tried to, and then there was a series of articles he wrote, finally culminating in a book called The Competitive Governments, which was published in 1996. The basic connotation that comes out is basically comes from the second generation theories of federalism, where government is not a benevolent entity. What exists, what is a basic competition between the governmental jurisdictions. And what you see is, now when you have this thing, so then you come up and then say, what are the basic, and in the first generation theory, you assume the government is benevolent, and therefore maximizing welfare is taken for granted by the government. You have this sort of a situation. If you really want greater efficiency, you need to have certain preconditions for competition. You need to regulate some preconditions for the competition. And then he set out the preconditions, something like a measure of competitive equality, cost benefit appropriability, and a variety of other things. Yeah. And then within this competitive situation, you can have cooperation. Both the parties are likely to gain from a particular venture.
Yeah.
Then obviously there will be cooperation. If one party gains more than the other party, there has to be a negotiation. So you need, you need some sort of an institution for intergovernmental bargaining and conflict resolution. That comes, these are some of the things. So coercive federalism is an extreme form of vertical intergovernmental competition, where you have an asymmetric power structure. A center which has a significant power has the power to coerce the state to do what it wants. So it's a vertical competition that you see that. But anyway, I mean that's on the analytical front. But unfortunately, in this country, people, it's everything is taken as a common sense idea, which is not really the case. There is very important. Say, for example, 200 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville talked about the federal government. The federal system was created with the intention of combining the different advantages which result from the magnitude and littleness of nations.
Right.
This means that you cater to the diversified preferences of the people, but at the same time reap scale economies in the provision of public services. And then, of course, Oates went on to say that all governments are federal, either more or less. And then came again Breton and said that there is a difference between the federalism and decentralization. And the difference is that under a federal system, you have checks and balances to prevent the killing of the jurisdictions or taking away their powers entirely. The point that you made earlier, under the federal system, you have the checks and balances. There is a certain measure of permanency. There is a certain measure of their existence is not threatened. Whereas in decentralization, you have that. Anyway, having said that, now let me come to the situation that we have. Let us take ab initio the point again you made, namely that there is a huge asymmetric power structure in the country.
Yeah.
You have a huge centripetal bias in the constitution. In addition to that, you have over the period of time, because of the development planning taken on the concurrent subject, social and development planning, which was taken on the concurrent subject, Raja Chelaya used to say, centralized planning is negation of federalism. Now, under that, you had controls over prices, you have controls over output, you had thing the center wanted. The states were basically implementing the plans, which is approved by the center. That is, they didn't really have the allocative powers as well. Even though we gave up planning in 1991, the legacies and the vestiges of the planning system have continued. Even today, you have a lot of uncontrolled prices. Even today, you have a lot of controlled government-controlled output. Now, when you have that, there are a variety of ways.
I think we may have lost him there. I think the connection has slightly broken. We'll just, I think, try and reach out to him to see if there was some connection issue. I think we can, yes, I think there was a connection issue. And I think we'll just come back to Professor Govind Rao once that connection issue is sorted out. I'll just request my colleague to maybe get in touch with him and see if there is any way we can have him back onto the discussion quickly. But Mr. Tyagarajan, just on a couple of points that you had made, I just sort of wanted to push it further a little bit and get your view on this. One very important point that you made was about the intricate linkage between the Tamil Nadu public health system and the need to have a certain kind of what can we say this medical health education, that one feeds into the other, that you've created a integrated way of tying up medical health and education that allows for this kind of integration, and that is something that you feel that NEET interferes with. I just sort of, the first initial thing, not a lot of our listeners may be very aware of this, so if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And second, don't you think, and just to pose the counter question, don't you think perhaps that to recreate something like this in another state which may not have a robust public health system, let's take a Bihar perhaps, that precisely more resources are needed to do it, and therefore perhaps it may not be such a bad thing if more money is put into a state like Bihar to create this linkage between public health and medical education. So just on these two quick points, if you could respond.
So I would say that medical education is quite unique in the sense that you cannot create doctors without having hospitals. I am an engineer, then an operations research major, then a PhD in psychology, then a finance major. I can study all these things without touching human beings. Maybe I have to do research on subjects. But you cannot be a doctor without having an attached hospital. And so it is crucial, and in a welfare state, one of the first services you want to provide to the people is free health, or at least to the extent possible free health. So these are intricately connected to each other, down to the way we give preferences, the kinds of incentives we provide for serving in rural health, primary health centers, and therefore getting a right to go to higher education in medicine. All of these have been intricately kind of put together from 1920s. Let me be very clear. This started back in the 1920s when the first Justice Party government came under Dayaki, and the Raja of Panagal passed a law removing Sanskrit as a prerequisite for studying medicine so that you could widen the intake pipe and get all kinds of people in. So partly because of our social justice model, partly because of the results, partly because, see, when you have reservations and you have quotas and all that, what does it do? Of course, it's short-term inefficient. But, and I'm a forward caste and I've suffered the consequences of it. But what it does is, for people who have been oppressed, for people who have no examples, for people who have no guides to show them, you can be like me. You know, I'm a graduate of MIT. At Lehman Brothers or at Stanford, they would send me to MIT to recruit, not to Harvard, not to Stanford, because the power of saying to the MIT student, I was once like you, automatically tells him he can be like me. And he can be a managing director and make millions of dollars. So what the value of having an example in your community, in your society, in your neighborhood, that we understand to be very powerful in overcoming the kind of structural hierarchies of caste and class and all that over centuries or thousands, millennia. So we have a system that we have fine-tuned, and we have produced phenomenal results, much better results than any other state in India by far, at least as far as health is concerned, and certainly of a large state. Places like Kerala have slightly better numbers in like infant mortality, but they are a much smaller state than us in size. So what we worry about is, why should either the central government or the states, in fact, the broader concern I have, since all of you are lawyers, is that the line between the judiciary, the administration or executive, and the legislature seems to have been completely erased in the last 4 or 5 years. The legislatures have become emasculated. You know, we are, whoever ruling party runs, we all say, yes, sir, 3 bags full. And then the administration and the judiciary, the relationship has become much more kind of subservient and kowtowing. And while I'm very happy to hear of the instances you gave, where judges stood up for states' rights and all that, my own experience as an MLA is that 5 or 6 seminal cases to whether this government continues and what is the right of a speaker compared to a right of an MLA have all languished in the courts for years and years, 4 or 5 years without hearing.
Yes.
So, you know, if you ask me, do I have faith that the judiciary is the savior? I say absolutely not. We have lost that faith. We assume that the will of the people is the only way we'll get out of a situation. And the fact that the law is on our side has not really gotten us that great an advantage. So from that perspective, I don't think it's a logical outcome that somebody should dictate to us how we should run medical education and public health, because they're so intricately connected to each other. Yeah. Sorry, what was the second question you gave?
The second point was about like assuming that we want and I think you sort of answered.
Oh no, exactly. No, sir. I am a patriotic Indian. In every federal structure, everywhere in the world, the better off states contribute to the less well off states. That happens in China, that happens in India, that happens in America, that happens everywhere. What we want is that the excess contribution over time narrows the gap. The rich and poor gap narrows. And so you don't have to have disparity. In India, we've been seeing the opposite. We've got a reverse situation. Nowhere in the world, I am a guy who has written multiple entrance exams myself. Nowhere, or standardized tests or whatever these entry tests are. Nowhere in the world is one test the sole basis for admission to anything.
Okay.
Not the MCAT, not the, I mean in the US, not the medical college, not the MBA, not GMAT, not GRE, not LSAT, not nothing. In fact, many schools have stopped taking the test altogether because the bias of race and class and wealth has become so obvious that, for example, during the lockdown, the University of California, the largest public university system in the world, has said, we simply will not use it. For 5 years, we will not touch it. It will not be a factor in admission at all. And we are trying to develop a test that can accommodate for those variations and still be a standardized test. If we get one in 5 years, we'll take it in 5 years. Till then, there is no standardized test. So why are we the only ones regressing backwards and saying that your whole future is dependent on the results of one test in one day? It is perverse and it is, it is stress inducing. We are seeing so many cases of suicide of people who have taken the test more than once before and then find it unbearable that having taken a year or two of coaching to do the test again, they don't have the confidence they can clear it. And, they're taking their own life. So this kind of, what can I say? Intrusion without sympathy, without compassion, without science, with the global benchmark going the other way, we consider that to be extremely kind of unfair and unjust.
Yeah. And that's a great point that you make. And I'll just very quickly alert our listeners that there is a Q&A tab If you have any questions on what you've heard so far, please feel free to send them. I will try and put it before our panelists. Professor Govindra is going to join us shortly in a minute or so. He's just getting his internet sorted once again. So he should be back online. But Mr. Tyagarajan, one more point very quickly that I sort of wanted to take on. In the context of the farm bills, I think this is one of those things that it's continuing to see a lot of debate and a lot of opposition to what the center has proposed. But one school of thought holds that why haven't states taken the lead on this? I know for a fact that Karnataka government has done a good job in kind of dismantling the APMC, not dismantling entirely, but replacing it with something slightly better. There are of course people who say it works well and people who say it doesn't work well. But what do you think is something that the state can do to address some of the issues that farmers face? Apart from, not to say that the opposition should be stopped or anything like that. They have a point of view; they should put it forward. But what can the state itself do to push forward, say, farmers' ability to make a proper livelihood for themselves out of farming?
So, at some level, I have deep background. My family has been in agriculture for 300, 400 years. So I feel like, I have some history. Of course, I'm not running the farm myself. But my interpretation and my understanding is if you take a look at Bihar, where the APMCs have been abolished for years now, they have not been able to achieve the outcome of getting farmers' income increased in a substantive way. So you have a system that is broken in many ways. If I take Tamil Nadu, from water resource management to fertilizer subsidy optimization, to crop optimization, to marketing channels, to the MSP, to monopoly procurement in the Kaveri Delta, whereas it's not in other places. There are 100 ways where you can actually make improvements, in my opinion.
Okay.
But you have 2 or 3 little issues, or rather 2 or 3 structural psychological problems. The first is none of these are going to be politically without cost. For example, we give free electricity to farmers. That's a Tamil Nadu thing. But I have evidence that shows that, let's say, about 50 lakhs to 1 crore a day of electricity is stolen by people who ought not to qualify for that free electricity in my Kambam Valley in Theni district alone, because they're running 50, 100 horsepower motors, sucking the water out of the river and doing kind of criminal things. So as much as it is about the law or the design, it is about the implementation and the discipline and the lack of corruption or the ability to actually enforce what laws you have. So I think that the first problem is this kind of, tenuous corruption to mafia kind of link in many of these businesses. The second is there is a huge arbitrage between farm and folk. The middle traders have such margins that there is a massive lobby there, and it is as bad in North India as it is in South India. So these lobbies need to be kind of taken out of the system. And again, in a democracy, you will find that these lobbies will easily kind of, subvert the process by lobbying with the resources that they have. The third problem, in particular with these farm bills and with the general approach that I see in the whole kind of corporatization of India, if the government of India cannot do it, and I'm a member of the PAC, today I have seen so many examples of the failure of central government schemes because the central government cannot implement it. It has to be implemented by the state or by a municipality or a corporation or a panchayat with the oversight of the state. And there are so many ways this fails. So when you have this kind of a situation where even the central government cannot implement these things at a national level, why do you assume that a mega corporate like a Reliance or a agro giant or a Parle or whatever can implement it? These are problems of complexity. I ran a large global banking business with a $170 billion balance sheet across 60 or 70 countries. These are not things that are easy to do. And that is when it's all professional, all digital, all online and real-time risk. Here you have 1,000 different languages, cultures, crops, rules. And so the odds that you can do this in a centralized way, where one person makes a design or a decision and you can get it done, is exactly zero. You have to either incentivize or empower or hold the states accountable. Even I can live with that. But it has to be a cooperative process. You cannot write laws in Delhi overnight without discussion and expect that the states will make them successes. You certainly cannot do it from Delhi, nor can your corporate partners do it. It's simply impossible, cannot be done.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tyagarajan. And we have Dr. Govind Rao back. Sir, and if...
let me start from where I left.
Sure.
So I said you have asymmetric power structure. You have the very heavy centripetal bias in the centripetal bias. The planning structure created a much more centralization. The bank nationalization created this thing that the entire financial sector is centralized.
Yeah.
And then obviously, when in that particular situation, and then the other thing is that for a long time you had a one-party rule. And when you had a single party rule for a long time, the rules of engagement between the center and the state didn't develop. Everything was done in an informal environment.
Yeah.
Today, you do not have an institution for intergovernmental bargaining and conflict resolution.
Right.
No, I mean, the states are helpless. Let us understand that. The center can go and roughshod, and go on a sort of roughshod, and the states only have to complain, and there is no way they can they can do anything about.
Yeah.
Now, and there are a variety of ways in which they they do. I mean, even if the SR Bommai decision resulted in the need for a check. There are you may not disturb the state, but then you can really make the state's life miserable in the in the way. So there is again the entire asymmetric arrangement between the ruling party and its friends or its own party in power and the ruling party and the opposition parties.
Right.
Now, I mean, say you have that sort of a thing. Now, let me come to some of the important issues that was mentioned. One is the issue of GST compensation, which you mentioned. There was an agreement that the center will give, and the states agreed to join the entire reform process by sacrificing their fiscal autonomy in the spirit of tax harmonization, only to see that, I mean, the entire thing is abrogated. Now, of course, everybody made a noise. The responsibility for giving the compensation rests with the center. You cannot abrogate. And in fact, you see, there is no provision like an insurance company saying that there is something called an act of God.
Yeah.
I mean, if the things did not happen, the other way could have been, rather than coming to the council with the two options and say that you take either of them or, sort of, I will do whatever I want. There should have been a discussion and say how we should go about this particular thing. And then obviously it is the responsibility. In fact, see, if you look at the minutes of the GST Council meeting at the time when the states agreed to give this power, it very clearly says, the finance minister gave an assurance that if necessary, they will go and borrow. Now, finally, a lot of, sort of this thing happened. Even though, of course, what you have is a suboptimal decision that only a certain portion of the losses are being met. So that's one part of it. But, the other thing is now Article 293, subclause 4. Basically, I mean, subclause 3 allows the states to borrow. But then if there is if they are indebted to the center, they have to seek the permission of the center to borrow. All the states are indebted to the center, they have to seek. Never in the history of this country, I mean, although in sort of 293 subclause 4, it says that central can give, put conditions for borrowing. Never in the history of this country have you seen. Hello?
Yes, sir. Go ahead. Hello?
We
can hear. Hello, we can hear you, sir.
Hello. Pona kuda?
Sir, we can hear you. You can go ahead.
Never in the history of this country have you seen a situation where never in the history of this country have you seen a situation where the conditions were put on the state's borrowing. But this now, again, this could have been discussed with the center. Should you really need one size fits all type of conditions? There are 4 conditions that I have put. Property tax reform, power sector reform, power sector reform, and sort of one's, sort of ease of doing business, and then, portability of ration cards, etc., etc. But, and obviously the Tamil Nadu as well as Punjab have gone about saying that they are not going to do the power sector reform. So you do have this, basic, hello.
Yes, sir. You go ahead. Go ahead, sir. You can hear you.
Let me put off the video because I think internet is unstable. So,
Sure.
So that's the second thing. Now, they did talk about the COVID. Now, Kerala actually, under the Epidemic Diseases Act 1987, actually started dealing with the COVID situation. But then the government of India had the National Disaster Management Act. And, one is the capacity of the center to deal with the diversities in states.
Yes.
Second thing is the most severe lockdown that has been put, placed in the country. I mean, even where there were no COVID cases, you say that, you cannot do anything.
Yeah.
And then you come up and say that whether the barber shop should be opened or whether the halwai shop should be opened. I mean, and then of course, this lockdown was done without even consulting the center. And then, you come up and say that, Kurukshetra war was won in 18 days and we will win this war in 21 days. And then, of course, you put the entire migrant labor in a very distressed situation because they don't have the reserves.
Yeah.
So, you have created that sort of thing. Farm laws. Now, again, agriculture is the state sector. Farming is the agriculture. But then marketing, particularly the interstate marketing, can be a central subject or a concurrent subject. Now, so you take up that, and then on the basis of that, you go about doing that. Of course, this is judiciable. Possibly some of the states would go and then.
Hello, Mr. Govindra. Hello, sir. Can you hear us?
Possibly some of the states would go to the court and they decide what, sort of this thing. So you do have a series of such things. And on the 15th Finance Commission, the 14th Finance Commission, thankfully, we did not have any problem. We went about doing our job. Of course, the 15th Finance Commission composition is such that there is a much greater consultation, at least with the center. I'm not sure whether the states. Of course, there is an advisory committee of which I am a member. But the point is that, sort of when the states send, that issue I will not go into how they did.
Okay.
But basic issue is the terms of reference. Now, in the terms of hello.
Yes, sir. Go ahead. We can hear you. Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Hello.
We can hear you, sir. Go ahead.
In the terms of reference, you see that first of all, it says that you should, the 14th Finance Commission has given a far too generous reward, sort of devolution. And then you should see whether, keeping in view the new India, 2022, whether you should give, whether you should consider basically nudging the commission to roll back on the tax devolution. I mean, there are issues on population which I will not go into because I believe that public services have to be provided to the people, and it is not the population of 71 or 91 or 2011. It's the current population that matters, but that's a different issue. Then, I mean, you should leave it to the community what they want to. Hello?
Yes, sir. Go ahead. We can hear you, sir.
Hello?
Yes, sir. We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, sir. We can hear you, sir. Please go ahead. Hello, Mr. Govindra. We can hear you. Please go ahead. Okay, I think he's had another internet troubles once again. I'll maybe while we wait for him to join in, I think, Mr. Tyagarajan, I have a couple of questions which have come in the meantime, and maybe I can just address them to you, and we can get your views on it. One is on this question of, there is a very interesting question asked by one Mr. Praveen Ravi. Given that some benefits in better coordination on medical education, why is it that there have been so few examples of states coming together and coordinating on these matters without the center dictating terms? And follow up would be that, what will it take for states to provide a coordination-based alternative to, like, say, central fiat? If you could just tell me, what are the issues with this kind? I mean,
no, I think that's a very valid question. So if you don't mind, though you haven't asked me, I just want to make 2-3 quick points. Number one, everything depends on your attitude and how you approach a problem. If you call me and ask me for consultation and engage me in the process, I'm more likely to go along with the outcome, even if it's marginally different from my perspective. If you impose it on me with no forewarning, with no input, with no kind of feedback, of course I rebel, number one. Number two, if the government of India believes that it needs a special fund for defense and security, I ask the question, which central government in which country in the world doesn't automatically look at defense and internal security as its own job? What were they doing from independence till now? All they're doing is finding a backdoor way to take some money away from the states. It's ridiculous to say you need a separate bucket for that. All along, it's been looked after by the center from its share of the taxes. Finally, Mr. Somnathan, the expenditure secretary, is a Tamil Nadu cadre officer, and I've had the chance to interact with him a few times. A learned man. You can make anything look like anything, right? You want to make a borrowing, you have to balance the fact that you want the government balance sheet to look decent and your rating to look decent, and yet you want to raise money, and yet you have to go do fiscal stimulus. I mean, that's what bankers do day in and day out. It's not complicated. It all depends on your attitude. If you believe you know all the answers, if you believe you are the omnipotent, all-seeing, all-knowing, and you are going to impose on others based on the limited, view that any one human being or 3 human beings have, you will fail. You could have easily resolved this GST dispute with exactly the same thing that you've done now, which is you make the center basically wrap a borrowing from, what have they done? They basically monetized it because they've taken it as a loan from the RBI. They could, Mr. Somnathan has been writing books about derivatives. We could have written this 100 different ways without having one disagreement and had the same risk net and had a conversation with the rating agencies and explained that this is what we do. I mean, I came out of Wall Street during the era of the kind of credit derivative and securitized risk and globalization boom. You can make anything look like anything and get it rated anything. So it is the attitude, I think, that starts the problem. But the point you made, I think, is a crucial point, is that we have to have a mechanism for the states to cooperate with each other without depending on Big Brother to be the link. And I think if you take places like the States, like the United States, because I lived there 20 years of my life, I know it best. There you have these mechanisms. You have a conference of congressmen or conference of state senators where people from different state governments, elected officials come together and you have a free exchange of ideas and you can help each other go and do this. Now we have, think tanks and NGOs like PRS Legislative Research in Delhi that try to do some of this, but there ought to be really a much more official government-to-government mechanism where the states can easily help each other with their respective knowledge and skills. After all, there's a huge migrant worker kind of net surplus, net donation, net demand, net donation equation. Surely it would behoove us to work well with those where we know our labor is coming from and facilitate the quality of their life here, in the sense that one of the rare things is India is that we don't have permanent migration. We have temporary migration, which creates a lot of quality of life problems. But were we to have a state-to-state interaction, we could alleviate a lot of those quality of life problems.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, sir. And I think we have Mr. Govind Rao. Sir, you have to unmute yourself. Dr. Govind Rao back. Sir, I think that last point that you were making on the 15th Finance Commission, so that is a very important point.
There was so as I was saying that, that was one part of the terms of reference. Then, saying that, Finance Commission is supposed to treat, the union and the states on par. To say that the states are doing populist measures and you control it is not something which in fact, late Mr. Guhan used to say that the finance commissions basically bark at the center but bite the states. I mean, that was, I mean, which is a fact.
Yeah.
They will go on saying that the center is doing that, this is doing this, they should not do it, they should not do this.
Yeah.
But then, when it comes to the state, they cut down the tax devolution to them, basic, or the grants to them.
Yeah.
And then you came up with the, the non-lapsable fund for defense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that happened in the meeting there, in the advisory meeting, is that when it came, I told them that, look, SS, it's very good that you should, you should allow them to have a non-lapsable fund. What you do is, you find out what all, ask the defense ministry to find out how much land it has and what are the various things it has. And then monetize the assets it has, and then actually from that you can keep create a non-lapsable defense fund.
Right.
Don't take it from the Consolidated Fund of India.
Yeah.
That is not, when you say that, defense is very important. Yes, of course it is important, but health is equally important.
Yes.
So obviously health is in the state subject. So
Yeah.
I am, I have a feeling that the Finance Commission possibly would have followed that route.
Sure.
Rather than trying to reduce the tax devolution. And then, asking them to do the monitorable, sort of incentives for the monitorable fiscal performance. Now, I mean, the question is, how do you monitor the center? How do you really incentivize the center? So you only want the states, you want to monitor the states.
Yeah.
And you don't want, and the Finance Commission goes away, and then it's basically the center to monitor the.
Yeah.
Asking, hello?
Yes, sir. Go ahead. No, it's fine. So go ahead, sir. We can hear you, sir.
Asking the center to monitor the states.
Yeah.
Now the point is that, and now you look at it. You put it on.
Yeah, I have. I have. So
farmers have gone on strike. Now, what you do? You say that, I am going to stop the train movements. The entire goods that has to go and then come back, sort of go. In fact, you create a distress situation in Punjab because farmers have gone on strike.
Yeah.
And then, the entire movement of the goods has been stopped. And, that is creating a huge hardship to the states.
Yeah.
So you basically, separate out which is the friendly state and which is not a friendly state. And the entire, basically, you create a situation for the opposition ruled states not to function.
Yeah. And
that's a very serious issue.
Yes.
And that comes from because of, as I said, you have a very heavy power, sort of asymmetric power structure. And more than that, there is no institution for intergovernmental bargaining and conflict resolution. And then, of course, the courts come in a long way. And then obviously there, I'm not sure that the courts will come at all.
So I have one question, which actually came in during the discussion, Mr. Govind Rao. One of our listeners wants to know, is the interstate council, like why does an interstate council not work? Where has it really failed in this respect? I think,
in fact, this particular issue of not having an institution for intergovernmental resolution was actually pointed out by the Sarkaria Committee report on center-state relations in 1988. And one of the things that they suggested is that you need to have an interstate council. And what the government of the day did was, this is a very great idea. We need to have an interstate council. And they created an interstate council and placed it within the Union Home Ministry.
Okay.
You can't have Mahendra Singh Dhoni becoming an umpire.
Right.
No, I mean, you see, Mahendra Singh Dhoni is a player. He is not an umpire. So in the process, what has happened, when it is a part of the Union Home Ministry, obviously Interstate Council lost that particular this thing. And then what happened? So they created a situation where there will be very infrequent meetings once in 2 years. And every state chief minister will go and give a speech for 10 minutes, and then there were also restrictions.
Yeah.
So speech for half an hour and then come back. And business as usual. Planning Commission the National Development Council used to be one institution. But then Planning Commission itself was created under the cabinet resolution. It is under the it's a part of the union government. Yeah. And then, of course, these states used to listen because some part of the grant used to come from the Planning Commission. Yeah. So you do not, so you had the Interstate Council, but then Interstate Council has failed to perform. Yeah. Initially, in fact, the Finance Commission could have been a permanent body. If you really look at Article 280 of the Constitution, it says the President shall appoint a Finance Commission within 2 years of the commencement of the Constitution, and thereafterwards every 5 years or earlier, as may be required. Yeah. Which means that you can have a Finance Commission appointed for 5 years, and then that goes and the new Finance Commission comes in. There could be continuity. But then that did not happen because Cabinet, the Planning Commission, which is created under a cabinet resolution in 1951, did not want the Finance Commission to be around. Actually, took away the powers of giving grants for plan purposes. And in fact, government of Tamil Nadu had appointed a commission on center-state relations under P. Rajamanna. And it pointed a number of issues relating to that. Sure. And one of the things was that the grant system was separated as a plan, separately for the Finance Commission was asked to look at only non-plan requirements. Planning Commission was asked to look at the plan grants. Yeah. And this continued. In fact, you see, when the third Finance Commission gave the report, the majority report was to cover 75% of the plan, but the member secretary wrote a note of dissent saying that only, the Finance Commission should not look at the plan side at all. And then the government accepted. That's the only time in the history of the Finance Commission that the government did not accept the majority recommendation. It accepted the member secretary's recommendation. Yeah. And now, until the 13th Finance Commission, so plan, non-plan distinction was made, but the 13th Finance Commission, somebody by oversight did not put this word plan, so it went into the entire revenue account. So the planning, so obviously Finance Commission was made a temporary body. So you do not really have an institution for intergovernmental bargaining and conflict resolution.
That's a good point, sir. And I think I would have wanted you to speak a little bit more on that, but unfortunately, we are almost out of time. And of course, even with our disruptions, I've sort of had to.
Because there is this doesn't happen usually, but
today is just unfortunate that happened. Yeah. I think Mr. Tyagarajan had one point to make before I close this particular discussion, sir. I think if you could just.
Sir, I just want to make the point that when the 15th Finance Commission came to Chennai for hearings, and in fact, Mr. Somnathan was then the kind of Sherpa, I asked 2-3 questions. I said, how do you define populist? Is MNREGA a populist? Is giving gas cylinders populist? In Tamil Nadu, we give free laptops and we give free cycles. Which is populist? How do you get to decide what is populist? Where you are on the economic spectrum will tell you what subsidies and what grants you give. We see it as investment. So there is no way that there is a populist definition universal to all, number one. Number two, this notion that the progress towards the center's goals should be the basis for grants is ludicrous. Some of the center's goals were met by us in 1975. 100% rural electrification or roads or whatever. We all, the rich states, passed 20 years ago. How will you then penalize us for not making progress on something we are at 100%? So this notion that you can somehow set a one-size-fits-all somewhere in Delhi and make that apply for the whole country is just ridiculous. Anybody with any understanding of complexity, forget fairness, forget constitution, the complexity of execution or the variability in current status tells you that simply will not work. So I think that this is the basic breaking point of if you do not get though Professor Rao made the distinction that there's a difference between federalism and decentralization, then they are also correlated, right? I mean, federalism calls for some decentralization, whether it's pulled back tomorrow or not. And unless you start being realistic about what can be achieved at what level, you will continue to find that you give away Swachh Bharat grants and Krish Kalyan grants, and they don't get utilized. Because even if the building is put, they don't have water. Or if you send money for whitewashing schools, they only have, thatched schools with no walls to whitewash. So I think it is the only way forward is federalism, including decentralization, not just of the expenditure side, but also of the revenue side. And I hope that you are right in the sense that the courts have that broader perspective, though today it may be missing from view, that they will revert to that at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you so much. I think on that note, it sort of perfectly captures what we have discussed over the course of 1 hour. I'd like to thank Dr. Govind Rao for having joined us despite all the unfortunate difficulties which we face with the internet. I think, sir, it was really informative, and it was really enlightening to listen to you on all these topics and your takes on all of that. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Tyagarajan for sparing time from his busy schedule to come and speak to us. I think it was a wonderful perspective that we got, and I'm sure we've all gone back much more enriched for what we have heard from you, sir. And I'd like to thank you all for listening in. Thank you all for sending your questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't take all. And please do join us for future sessions of this discussion. Thank you all, and good evening to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Good evening.